my name is Serkan. I'm a researcher at the University of Leuven in Belgium in anthropology department, at the same time in the media studies. Today we will talk about with Daniela with radicalism and extremism. So it's a very hot topic nowadays, especially with the rise of the far right groups as well. Before it was the Islamic extremism. Nowadays it also extend to the far right groups as well, and nowadays in Europe as well. So here in this session, Daniela will introduce the conceptual clarifications of radicalism, extremism, fundamentalism, as well as some of the main approaches, some methodologies to explain this radicalization process. So we will discuss also the recent developments relating to the considering the topic of the populism as well, and also the influence of the pandemic, how this pandemic also impact the radicalism or extremism debate as well. And today's speaker, Daniela Pisoiu, is a senior researcher at the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, and also she is a lecturer at the University of Vienna. Her work is focused on Islamist and far-right radicalization, terrorism, and extremism in Europe. Specifically, I think, if I remember correctly, her first book is about the Islamist extremism, published in 2013 in Routledge, which is, I recommend that you to read this book. It's a very good book to understand, especially the Muslim extremism, the root causes specifically in Europe. And she is also the author of the several books, including the terrorism, and also some articles published in various journals on these topics. As also, she's a quite active member of the Radicalization Awareness Network, which is a good network. Just I think it's created by the European Commission. Now is very active, specifically gathering different networks in Europe by looking on extremism, preventions, whatever. And the floor is yours, Daniela. So thank you again for the organizers, and also Daniela, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So what I'm going to do is, as mentioned, look at radicalization, extremism, and then basically discuss this phenomena a little bit in the context of populism. So I will highlight a little bit what has populism meant for especially extremism, and especially the far right kind. At the beginning, I just wanted to, so as mentioned, there's two reading materials that you guys already have. One is about some basics, how to research extremism and radicalization. The other one is on concepts, and this one is very, very thick. This is because I did a lot of research at the time. I must say, when I was researching for this, it was 2006, so it was really the beginnings of radicalization research. It doesn't mean that before people didn't inquire into this question, for example, how individuals become terrorists. But the term radicalization was basically proposed, and as you could see in the chapter as well, it was proposed by the European Commission and also defined by the European Commission. And then afterwards, academics came up with models, theories, explanations, which of course in the majority already existed, but they weren't called radicalization, but something like becoming a terrorist, right? So the point is, at the time one had the word, but one didn't know exactly what the word really means. And up to this day, there is very much controversy what it means, and there's various definitions. However, radicalization, the word did exist, of course, in other contexts, especially in history. So what this chapter basically tries to do is to trace a little bit and try to contextualize radicalization based on what we also know from other fields. I just highlight a few points, and then I started with my slides. So first of all, of course, the fact that initially radicalization was very much applied to Islamism, right? So to Islamist terrorism, because emerged in a phase where jihadi terrorism hit Europe. Jihadi terrorism of a particular kind, because of course we know in France there was the 90s where there was Islamist terrorism already happening, but this kind of global jihad hitting first Spain and then the UK, so 2004, 2005, that was the period where people started to use the word, and basically there was a lot of effort put into understanding what's going on. So it was initially this emphasis. Now, of course, as already mentioned, the far right and far right extremism and terrorism has become, of course, very prevalent. But even before that, there were efforts to carry out so-called comparative research. So some of the models explaining radicalization were meant to also apply to other kinds of extremism and not just to Islamism. Another point that I wanted to also remind you guys of is that being radical and radicalization doesn't necessarily have to be negative. So historically seen, actually the first radical movements were we would call now good movements, because they were fighting for human rights, equality, and stuff like that. So initially radical, and still means, radical basically means a radical change, a change from the root of fundamental change. And these initial efforts were actually good, normatively good, whereas of course the meaning changed, especially at the dawn of the Second World War. So at that period, radicalism started to be used in a very negative manner. The core of the thing is really to say, of course, apart from going to the roots and the idea of sweeping change, the idea of it being something political. And this is something that we always need to remember. Radicalization is about politics. It's not about integration, for example, right? So we have, people who radicalize, they have usually a political and must have a political purpose. And this is the kind of framework that we should look at the phenomenon in. Another point to make is extremism, although I will also show a few important, basic points on the slides. Extremism is a lot more concrete generally than radicalism. Radicalism doesn't have a particular ideology. So we have a lot of waves and a lot of movements that were called radical at some point or the other, whereas extremism is very specific in nature, because extremism usually relates to, first of all, a political system. So you have the extremes of the political system, and it usually refers to it being against democracy. So it's very much concrete in its nature, and that's important. Now, what is the relationship between the two? Of course, radicalization can lead to violent extremism, right? But it can also lead to something else. It can have a violent extremist ideology or not, right? So you can see radicalism as a more general concept, whereas extremism is a more specific concept. And then you also have fundamentalism, and there's many ways of thinking about the three, which one is more general, which is more specific. Usually fundamentalism, of course, refers to religion, and it refers to a certain conservatism, which might be political or not. So again, this is something which is more specific than radicalism. And I also wanted to, I think it's at page 17, I think it's important to remember that there are certain characteristics which are specific. I mean, some authors at least have tried to identify some characteristics specific to extremism, regardless of ideology. And that's interesting, because usually when we talk about the far right or the far left, we have certain things in mind, something anti-Semitism. Yeah, so, if you're far right, you're usually anti-Semitic, or of course you're against foreigners, or you think that, a certain category, refugees are something bad. But there are some general characteristics that really apply to all, well, basically far right and far left as well. Such as, for example, a claim to exclusive truth, right? Or not accepting other opinions, fanaticism, that's also a characteristics. The idea of putting the world right again, so the world is in a kind of a bad state, and it has to be put in put right again. This again is only the tip of the iceberg. It's a lot of stuff that you can read here, but I will not go more into detail. The other thing that I wanted to also highlight refers to the process. So when we say radicalization, we always mean a process. So something that happens in time, it has phases. And this was not necessarily always clear, or sometimes it's not even now, because people tend to think of sudden change. For example, oh, this guy was such a nice guy, the neighbor, a nice neighbor, and then all of a sudden he became a terrorist. Well, this does not exist. Nobody radicalizes overnight. But also conceptually, when you say process, then it's usually a sequence of phases. And the question is, how can we imagine it? How does this really happen? Because also in most of the, or not in most, but in many theories or explanations, people tend to focus on the initial moment. They're looking for elements of crisis, for example. Something happens and then, you know, it's like it triggers for something. And if we look at the broader research also on social movements, then we realize that the most important phase to look at is during radicalization, not before. Yeah, so there's always, of course, a little step that pushes somebody towards in a certain direction, but what happens afterwards is more important. It's a socialization process, during the radicalization process, the way in which a new identity is formed, and this basically slowly but surely leads to eventually an act of violence. And why am I saying this? Because, for example, you might have heard, well, you know, people have identity crisis, or people have other kinds of crisis, that's why they radicalize. Well, no, this alternative identity, or this separation from the mainstream, occurs during and as a result of the radicalization process. Or things like, oh, he doesn't go to school anymore, he quit work. Well, this is usually because of radicalization and not a cause. Why? Because people are then, of course, very much preoccupied with what they're doing now, which seems more important than everything else, or is not compatible with their place of work. You know, it can be that something at work is basically contradicting their ideology, so they have to quit. So these are a couple of points that are important to remember, because in this field you have all sorts of also very complex models, but also very simplistic explanations. So always be aware and try to question when you see something, especially in the press, or especially in the kind of populist discourse that we have now, which tends to also go into the direction of ethnicity is a cause. Yeah, the person is ethnic so-and-so, or is immigrant, and that's why. Yeah, and this is a major mistake. It's basically confusing a feature with a cause. So nobody does something because one is something. Yeah, one needs to look at the situation and the kind of causation chain that eventually led to a certain act. Okay, and now I'm going to start showing some pictures finally. 1 second, because I had a second slide, I need to go back. Okay. So can you see it? Can you see slides? Yeah, you can see. Yeah, excellent. So title. So radicalization, extremism, and then basically in the populist age, let's see what's going on at the moment and what are the effects on radicalization and extremism in this, yeah, let's call it populist age. What I'm telling you is especially based on the first book that was mentioned before, and the third book that is basically looking at theories of terrorism, especially tracing what we have to more general and broader theories in social sciences. Why? Because terrorism study is a very multidisciplinary field. So we are drawing on political science, on sociology, on psychology, course of political science, and it's important to know where these things are coming from and how to really understand and work with them, because sometimes you see something on terrorism but the article doesn't tell you exactly what context and how they come up with this concept in the first place. So just a few basic points. Radicalization is of course a process, so it's a gradual adoption of cognitive behavioral patterns aimed at inflicting fundamental political, economic, social, and cultural change. So here, important point, it has a cognitive and behavioral component. So I can be, for example, cognitively radical. I can think radical things, but not do something about it. Or there are also cases of people who do things that are radical, but they are not necessarily ideologically radical. And this, by the way, we see nowadays actually quite a lot. So individuals who are not particularly indoctrinated, but who engage, for example, in terrorism. And we see this a lot in the lone actor attacks lately in Europe. As mentioned, radicalism is not necessarily negative. In fact, historically, it was initially positive in nature. On the contrary, extremism is relative to something considered middle or mainstream and has always actually been negatively connoted. This is the theory, okay? In practice, especially if you look, for example, at the way in which the European Union is talking about radicalization, but also other political actors, it's usually in relation to violence. So this is the definition that the European Commission is using at the moment. So a phased complex process, so far so good, in which an individual or group embraces radical ideology or beliefs, uses or condones violence, including acts of terrorism with the meaning of the directive. The directive is basically a new document that added to the definition and criminalization of terrorism additional acts. But you see here that we have violence. Why? Because on the one hand, there is the concern of saying, well, the liberty of expression, so people should be allowed to think what they want as long as they don't engage in, for example, violent behavior. Another issue, and we can also see with the OSCE, with their concept of world, violent extremism, radicalization that leads to terrorism. So very clear disassociation with violence because there is a concern of politically labeling certain movements or individuals or extremists or terrorists just because they have certain ideas. Now, this has not prevented the politicization of this concept. So basically states labeling certain individuals or movements as terrorists and then going after them for political reasons, but not based on actual evidence. But anyways, that's at least the idea in practice. Current issues of concern in the EU are of course lone actors, as mentioned before, foreign terrorist fighters and others, which I will talk about more in detail. But just in general, what we can say, looking at the entirety of the work that has been done so far and the kinds of empirical evidence that we have so far, is that we don't actually have a profile. People have tried at the beginning to identify some individual features that could predict or at least identify who is or might become a terrorist, but that's of course not possible. However, you have functional profiles. So you have, for example, individuals who are ideologues or individuals who are managers. So basically they manage the group or they manage the cell, or they do activities in funding, so in finance or communications, or recently, of course, IT people who take care of the online presence of the group. Lately, with the gamification of extremism, we have also seen actually game developers who have become active in this scene and even created an extremist game. So all sorts of, depending on what they do, because, and this is again an important point to say, terrorism and to a certain extent also extremism is something that people do, right? So terrorism is an act, is not something that one is. I mean, like, as an organization or individual, you can do all sorts of things, one of which is terrorism. How radicalization usually occurs, pathways are multidimensional, so you cannot really identify one line of causation. What we have seen recently, and it's very current nowadays, is the issue of lone actors, and this not only in the jihadi but also in the right-wing scene. So lone actors as such, and lone actors in mental health. So increasingly, I wouldn't say it's the majority yet, but increasingly individuals who have mental health issues, whereas the question is, what is the role of this variable? It seems, especially in the jihadi scene, that basically mental health is an existing condition and ideology comes at some point very late without very deep indoctrination. It's important to look at context. So people have, of course, tried to develop models that are universally applicable. Well, that's not the case. So what we have done in Europe might apply perhaps also to other regions, but definitely not to all, because radicalization is very much dependent on the cultural and the historical context, not necessarily concerning the main mechanisms, but the way in which certain narratives are formulated, for example. Also very current, it has always been there, but now we see it even more, the idea of subculture and pop culture. So what I mean by subculture refers, of course, first of all to aesthetics. So videos, pictures of various kinds, video games, but it also means the idea of community. So we have the brotherhood, the comradeships, the sisterhood. So this being together as a community, more or less us against the world, this is a very important component that keeps people in spite of difficulties, in spite of repression. And subculture also means certain rituals and certain practices that people do. So when you radicalize, then you learn and you implement certain types of behavior that in a sense also confirm the fact that you belong to this group and to this subculture, and differentiates you from others in a positive way, of course. Another line of work that is relatively new is the idea of resilience. So people have started to inquire not necessarily into the root causes or what leads to radicalization, but what keeps people from radicalizing. So what are the protective factors in radicalization, given the situation where you have a group or even a bigger group out of which only some radicalize and some don't. And these are some of the things that we know so far that contribute to preventing people from radicalizing in the first place. So things like critical thinking, healthy social environment, having an occupation. Yeah, so actually having something to do is actually quite very important. Self-esteem, self-control. And these are in practice, for example, things that are applied or taught or inculcated to young people, for example, in the education system. Now to give you some examples of what I mean, so now we have some pictures coming. Lone actor, there's quite a few. This is a right-wing scene thing, so my data is majorly from Europe and especially the German-speaking world, but I think you will see parallels to other regions as well, especially since we have this kind of communication and globalization exchange between various even continents. So in right-wing terrorist scene in Germany, we've had quite a few lone actor attacks. I'm going to show you just two of them. This is one where the perpetrator tried to replicate the Christchurch attack in a synagogue. He failed to enter, but then he killed other people outside. And you can see here that it's basically the kind of, it's a little bit of a mix. And this is, by the way, another issue that is more and more prevalent, an ideological mix. So it's really difficult sometimes, or most of the times, to identify what kind of ideology this person is into, because there's a mix of elements from various ones. So here, for example, you have the kind of classical far right thing, but also this kind of conspiracy theory, civil war that comes more from the US recently, but also a certain profile of this lone actor. So somebody who was rather isolated, without a job, without a hobbies, and so forth. But what you also see here is the very strong influence of the internet. So he radicalized majorly on the internet. He even made his weapon himself based on indication from the internet, which again, as such, is not new. But before, what we knew in the jihadi scene was, for example, people trying to build bombs, for example. But a quick note, just having the internet here doesn't mean that the internet radicalizes. Again, an important point to remember. The internet transforms certain mechanisms and processes, makes them more intense, but as such does not radicalize people. So for example, you need exchange, you need confirmation from other people, you need to be fed information the whole time, if possible from one source or sources that are basically coming from one particular direction. And the internet can do that a lot more and a lot more intense. So, but the basic mechanism is not different. This is another example of a lone action attack in Germany, again, far right. This one is a little bit more, even more distance from the classic, or from the classic far right ideologies. You can see here there's even some commonalities with the QAnon relating to the victimization of children in the underground. Here, the mental health was definitely an issue. It was already diagnosed. And we see again the typical kind of neo-Nazi idea of our people is degenerating. We have to basically keep it clean, keep it not tainted by other peoples. But also the anti-Islam thing, which came more strongly with the new right. But I will talk more about that a little bit later. Another point I wanted to illustrate a little bit what I said before about subculture and pop culture. This has become very prominent in both in the far right and in the Islamist scenes. Of course, there's also a far left. I'm not ignoring it by saying it doesn't exist. Of course, it exists. However, if you look at the threat assessments in Europe, these two are basically the major issues now. Islamism for a while, Islamist terrorism for a while, but increasingly also far right terrorism. So here I wanted to just give you some examples. This is something done by the so-called identitarians. This is a new right movement. In essence, it's similar to the alt-right in the US. In Europe, we call it a new right, or basically that's how they call themselves. It's not new. I mean, in terms of ideology, it basically recycles the Nazi, neo-Nazi ideology, but it presents itself in a very fresh, a very attractive, very young appearance. And here pop culture plays a major role. So for example, this is a game, The Day of the Siege, and you can see parallels to their kinds of posters. This is done every year. It's a march in Vienna celebrating the fact that the Turkish army was pushed back at the time, and Europe was defended. And the idea of this is to make a parallel to today, where again in their picture of Europe, the European culture is again threatened by all kinds of foreign elements, and one needs to defend it again. This is another example. This is their logo, and it's not a coincidence. It was on purpose that they took it from the movie 300. Because there also you have a situation where the enemy is Muslim. In that case, of course, it wasn't Sunni Muslims, but doesn't matter. But they took it on purpose because they knew that this kind of imagery is attractive to young people in Europe or in the West, or even in other places. I don't know. Yeah, because it belongs to the pop culture. This is another version of the poster a little bit later, so you can see again the art, very, very contemporary in nature. What they also do, and this is something that we've been having actually for a long time, it's the merchandise. So we have had that also from in other kinds of areas, but here what I wanted to show is that basically the merger with pop cultural elements. So here, make love and defend Europe. So this kind of existing pop cultural slogan combined with their own slogan of defending Europe, or Islam is not welcome. And this, again, this is not just a coincidence. This is it's a very important rhetorical element, and an element that is useful in attracting sympathizers and members. This is another combination of pop culture and what is said around it is from a recognized far right author. The slogan, or this celebrate diversity, actually a left-wing or I don't know, mainstream slogan, I suppose, but then with their kinds of iconographies attached, including from the historical Nazi period. And this is again something that we see a lot in the contemporary far right, is it's a way of distorting mainstream and especially left-wing slogans and ideas and imagery. And the strategy is to basically occupy this kind of discourse and change it towards their own ideology. something from the other side, also in the sense, so basically the same subcultural aesthetics, pop cultural elements. And I'm showing this because we know for sure, and how do we know? There have been interviews with people who radicalized. I've also done quite a few with individuals who, for example, radicalized, became foreign fighters and went to Syria. And they confirmed that this kind of material was actually influential in the radicalization process. So here on the left, we have a former rapper called, with his rap name, There's a Dog, who then basically converted to Salafi jihadism. And then we see him in his new posture as a jihadi fighter. And he also went to Syria and died. And the story is that the strategy at the time was for a Salafi preacher to basically recruit him and say, you know, you're very attractive to young people. Let's cooperate, and we organize some events where you can, you know, do your thing, and then I can talk about religion a little bit, and that's how we can attract more young people. So these things, again, I think one of the messages I wanted to leave with you is that yes, there are causes and there are individual motivations, but there are also actors who are the extremist organizations or individuals, recruiters, ideologues, who have their own strategic interests and who actively recruit people and make all these things attractive. And these things we also have to consider. Also very typical for the Islamic State or Daesh is not just, as you see here again, the way in which they took some pop cultural slogan and changed it, adapted it to their own propaganda. So apart from this, we have seen a very strategic and concrete effort to recruit individuals with criminal pasts. Yeah, so we have here what they mean with people with the worst past. They mean people with criminal pasts. And indeed, on average in Europe, about 50% of foreign fighters and IS recruits in general were individuals with criminal past, where the narrative was, you know, you can have a better life, just continue to do what you're doing, but still you have a better life than afterwards because you're doing it for a good cause. Here also the way in which they played a little bit with video games, again in their propaganda, and also the fact that to show that, for example, anyone can join, it doesn't matter what color of the skin you have, the important thing is to basically you know, give your oath of allegiance, and then it's fine, doesn't matter who you are, where you're coming from. Yeah, just a little bit more to see how also the combination of course more traditional and more modern elements to show this this image of masculinity, of heroism, but also basic material gains that were also actually important for some other people. Some of the people went for purely political reasons. For some others, actually having a job and a good life was not necessarily unimportant. And yes, guns, masculinity, also a role to play. Of course, also in the far right. This black aesthetics, very typical for the Islamic State and actually very popular. So, for example, here in Austria, we had a relatively large number of young people who found this is Jihadi John, by the way, from the UK, found the aesthetics very interesting and cool. So, and kind of sending around videos with violent stuff, just because, you know, to show that they can, and they can look at such horrible things. So, and this was very much a fashion for a while. Of course, it died out to a large extent. But it shows the amount of impact that these things can have on people. This is an individual, and you can see he has become actually very influential with the IS. He's also from here, from Austria, and was he went there together with Desert Dog, and you see his evolution in time. So this was the first trial here, where he was still just wearing this Palestinian headscarf, and then it changed. You can see some Afghan attire also during the trial, and then he was actually convicted, and after the sentence he went out again, went to Germany and radicalized even more. That's where he burned his Austrian passport, and then he goes to Syria, where there's a couple of videos with him killing hostages and whatnot. But you can see how basically he changed from an initial, by the way, he was Al-Qaeda sympathizer to an IS, and how this whole appearance also changed with him. Now, after throwing all these pictures at you, I'm going to talk a little bit about theory to give you an overview a little bit how researchers and how literature so far has explained radicalization, or why individuals engage in terrorism. And basically, there's three avenues of looking at it. Usually, or in popular thinking, perhaps people tend to think of organizations as strategic actors. So when we talk about IS or Al-Qaeda, we're thinking, well, they're doing it for a reason because they want to achieve something. Whereas with individuals, it's very often the tendency of thinking of causes. So he was poor, he was not educated, he had a bad life, and so forth. Yeah. So very rarely do we think of the strategic objective that maybe an individual might have, or his or her kind of gain. And these two things are basically a strategic intentional approach versus a deterministic approach. But there are also other kinds of lenses that look at process in particular, and these are the developmental lenses. Where is this coming from? In terms of determinism, this is really is a basic kind of social science division, looking at structure or at agency. So when I explain something, do I feel something happens because of the structure around it? The circumstances made this person do something, or agency. This person wanted to do something, right, with a certain purpose. So in deterministic approaches, we tend to look at structure, causes, root causes, whereas intentional approaches, we tend to look at the individual, and we're thinking, well, what does he want to achieve with it? What are the gains? Does he have any gains out of it? And by the way, it doesn't have to be of material nature, like I showed you before. It doesn't have to be a villa in a car. It can also be of, and usually is of immaterial nature, in the sense of affection, recognition, rewards. I have the impression I can do something. You know, I don't just watch something and I feel outraged or whatever. I can actually have an effect on something. Or I have friends, I have support, I have some people around me that like me, they find me cool. So all of these things are also benefits, even if they're not material. And then there's the so-called, is a more recent thing. Essentially not recent, it comes from the social movement research, but as applied to radicalization is a recent approach to look at processes and relationships between individuals, between the organization and the state, between various kinds of organizations, and so forth. Now, a little bit more in detail, what I mean by deterministic approaches. And again, these are things that are out there. I'm just basically grouping them based on their inherent logic to make them more accessible, or basically to offer people a kind of an orientation when you read something. Okay, well, they have this kind of assumptions then. So what kind of root causes are we talking about? Things like relative deprivation. What does it mean? It means that basically I see me or my group as disadvantaged as opposed to another group, although we should be the same, or we should actually have even more, right? So it's unfair kind of the distribution of advantages, as it were. Humiliation can also be, it can be individual or as a group. So this one was, for example, used a lot with regard to the Palestinians, for example, and their constant humiliation with the checkpoints and all that stuff. So as a group. We also have a relatively solid psychoanalytical line of research looking at personality characteristics such as narcissism. And narcissism has come up also recently with regard to certain lone actors, such as, for example, Anders Breivik, who was even diagnosed with narcissism. Essentially, what narcissistic injury refers to is a situation where the person has lost the self-esteem based on things that happened during childhood. What split externalization means is that basically one or the individual splits a good and a bad part of him, and the bad part he projects on somebody else who's usually the enemy. By the way, there's also analysis of Hitler that argued in this way. And then as a final element, the individual joining the group brings this self-esteem also a little bit back, because the person gets a recognition and the appreciation of the group. Identity is also something that comes up, but usually in a more in a less scientific manner. So usually when people talk about identity, they mean hybrid identity or loss of identity, whereas the identity process in the psychoanalytic sense is actually more complex, and this has so far not really been applied as such. Now, the point, the idea with these root causes is that they're easy to work with, because from a counterterrorism perspective, for example, if you have the causes, you just need to erase the causes, and then you solve the problem. But in practice, there have been some issues, such as, for example, that many people tend to share these kinds of root causes, but they don't radicalize, right? So it's basically saying that the causes are not sufficient, probably, but also not necessary, because there are also cases of individuals who do not share these characteristics and still they radicalized and became terrorists. There's a number of other issues that are here, but I will not insist. I think I can share the slides so you can look later if you want. Intentional approaches is something different. So we don't look at the causes, we look at the purpose. So for example, if somebody is joining a group, or if somebody decides to do a certain act, what is the gain for this person? As I say, it's not the economical thing, it's not the economic thing, but more like an everyday type of rationality. So we're not talking about the the economical person that always does the right decisions. No, it's of course a subjective process, but the idea is that here individuals make certain decisions in expectation of positive feedback. And more than that, if there is a positive feedback, then the person will continue doing this, or doing even more of this in expectation of the positive feedback. So, and this is one of the explanations of why people remain in a group or remain in this process and even go further. And finally, relational approaches, it really looks more on what is going on during the process. So less what was before, but what's going on whilst a person is already in a group, because of course this process is very gradual, and they very much focus on things like beliefs, norms, and values. So how individuals are socialized in a certain way of looking at things, and then how that reflects in behavior. And this comes from social movement theory, but we can also see it in certain criminological theories that focus on norms and values, such as, for example, deviant norms and values. So there's been work that compares radicalization with, for example, gangs, based on the fact that gangs, but also radical or extremist groups, have alternative norms and values that depart from the mainstream, which is, of course, true. Question is, why? And this deviance literature argues that people choose these alternative norms and values because they cannot succeed with the mainstream ones. Whereas others say, well, no, that's not the reason. They want different ones because they think they're better. So now that's a side discussion. What is also interesting here, I think, is from the social movement theory perspective, and it's important, especially thinking ahead at the idea of populism, the framing theory. So here, social movements people have said, well, after a certain while, it's not necessarily important what the grievances are. If there are grievances, what is important is how movements frame it. If the framing of a problem is convincing enough. And they developed a number of criteria that tell us whether a framing of a problem is has potential to convince people or not. And this is not the same as ideology, for example. Yeah, I mean, most of extremists and terrorists, they're not very well read. Let's put it this way. So what is important in radicalization processes is not the ideology as such, but this framing, so slogans, simple explanations of things, catalog of rules that you're supposed to, that you're not supposed to do. Yeah, so all sorts of simplistic ways or looking at things are basically glasses that guide people. This is a way of looking at radicalization as a model, and just really quickly going through the main elements. It says that you have this graduality in time. Centrifying refers really to this phase of focusing on something. Yeah. So many people might have contact to a hate preacher or some hate speech or some videos, right? And then they go on and see about their own business. But in the cases where people start to look at these things a lot, and their friends do also, and then they do it in a group, and then they quit doing something else and just doing that. So really starting to focus on certain issues, on certain people, on certain debates, on certain discourse that basically fixates these people in the radicalization pathways and off towards professionalizing is basic when you already start doing it as or almost as a profession. So not just that you have, I mean, some people start having certain tasks in an organization, but also they receive training, for example, and they see themselves as something that they do as their activity, profession, which can be the main one or on the side. So for example, quite a few of the far-right terrorists or extremists who end up in trials are a hobby. Yeah, so they are by day a regular citizen, by night they have all these activities which are not less organized and professional in that sense. Here we have what I call interpretive frameworks, and really it relates to this idea of framing. So basically how regular motivations, because of course everybody wants to achieve in life, everybody wants to have recognition, everybody wants to make a difference, but what really is the difference to normal existences is these interpretive frameworks which frame all of this in a different light. So the question is, what is valuable? Yeah, so what is valuable to do and what is not? And that really depends on this framing. And this framing has then also an effect, and this you can see throughout the history of terrorism, if it's left-wing or right-wing or Islamist, how this affects then your everyday life. And that's what I mean by rules-directed redesigning, where your whole life is being turned upside down and redesigned to match these new framings. That includes the kinds of people that you see, that includes the kinds of work that you do, the kinds of things that you think are important and others that are not so important, and so forth. What we've seen, especially because in the end, I mean, you have all these things, you know, you have many people, especially now with the capital, you've seen how many people can be mobilized at a certain point. So you really have a mass of people with certain ideas and also with certain lifestyles. But not all of them, or at least on a regular basis, actually get mobilized into violence. And the question is, when do you become active? And what I think is very important is the closeness to certain things, or even the emotional aspect sometimes. And we've seen this especially with the foreign fighters who've seen all these videos of pain of the civilians and so forth. But what you of course need is the opportunity. It has to be possible. You have to have the manpower, you have to have the gun or whatever it is that you want to use. Also important, you have to kind of feel a moment of threat. So it has to be an impression that if you don't do something now, then everything is lost. This is of course very, very subjective, but it has to be there in the mind of the person. And what of course very much helps is the organization, not necessarily if you have these kinds of knife attacks, that there you don't need an organization, although you do need kind of a mentor, a guiding post, but it's not the same as organizing a large terrorist attack in a classical sense. So these are a little bit the main points. Again, I will skip that, and then we go to what you guys have talked about, I guess, for the rest of the week. And I'm not a populism scholar, so about populism you definitely know more than me. I'm just looking at basically what has populism done with extremism, and it's also an issue for me because I have dealt in my work with terrorism and extremism, but now I have to also concern myself with populism, because we have seen effects on extremism, and especially in the far right. But now, after the events and developments in the US especially, but we also see them in Europe increasingly, we also see new kinds of dynamics emerging as well. So one major thing that has been already noted is the so-called political mainstreaming of right-wing extremist discourse. So right-wing extremism usually, and also that's what the word says, used to be something at the extremes, at the margins. So mainstream very big, extremist very small. Now, especially given the constellation in a number of countries of right-wing populist parties, but also right-wing populist and right-wing extremist parties together, we are seeing basically this mainstreaming of right-wing discourse, of right-wing extremist themes and topics. So framing, remember frame, ways of looking at things. And this is of course very dangerous, because this has the potential of radicalizing masses, not just individuals or small groups. Typical example, of course, with the US and Trump, but this is not something that is not existent in Europe either. And what do we see this? What are the effects of it really? And I mean, I'm sure there's more, but I'm just mentioning here a few of them. We see what I put here as reification of suspect communities, and I think you guys know who they are. They are the Muslim community. So, and this is something that, of course, the new right has pushed very much to say, we're not talking about race anymore. We're talking about cultures. We're not explicitly talking about Jews anymore. We're talking about Muslims. The Muslims is the new, as it were, enemy. And within this mainstreaming, we have the suspect communities means that looking or talking about Muslim communities as something potentially problematic for Europe. And you can see this in various kinds of ways. Another effect is, of course, the strengthening of right-wing extremist presence. So the recognized right-wing extremist parties and movements see their ideas confirmed by mainstream politics, which basically strengthens them, not just in terms of they don't hide anymore, they're out there in the open communicating their right-wing extremist message, but they also increase in terms of sympathizers and members. And of course, the diffusion of right-wing extremist ideas in the mainstream population. So whereas the mainstream political discourse is changing and the media, then you can also see how these things affect the ways in which the population is thinking. Now, having established that, is not the whole story. What we also see increasingly is really, really new. It's a new kind of polarization. I mean, of course, we had right and left before, but here it's a different kind. So it's a conservatism versus liberalism, whereas conservatism increasingly starts to include Christian fundamentalism. So this is increasingly present and visible. At the same time, a kind of a polarization or radicalization, perhaps, of the left as well. And this is still in development, but I think we'll see a lot more of it. And of course, conspiracy theory. So this is a phenomenon of itself, but certainly if some mainstream politicians share such ideas, this of course leads to this movement increasing in numbers and strengthening. And I don't remember now the exact percentage, but it's enough to see how many people in the US believe in QAnon. And this is not something that remains in the US, but also has appeared quite a lot in Europe as well. This, what I'm telling you now, just briefly, is something that I did with a colleague from the University of Hamburg. And this is where we, under the umbrella of mainstreaming of right-wing extremism, we looked at how far-right extremist, new right and populist frames overlap. So we wanted to know, are they talking about the same thing or something different? Is their framing of the problem the same or actually different? Because they say they're different, especially the populist parties and movements say they are not extremists. I mean, we are something completely different. And of course, we concluded that they actually talk about the same thing, and not just that, the problem that they identify is the same, and the problem has remained the same for decades. It's not something new. It's basically the threat to a we, which is the German people who are supposed to remain pure. Of course, now more defined in cultural terms, not necessarily in race terms, but under threat by this mass of individuals coming from other cultural places, usually refugees. And I mean, you can see, I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which this has been illustrated on Twitter, but creating this impression of invasion. So you see this masses of people coming, or this apparent plan of Islamists to basically conquer Europe. And so I have a little bit of examples here, what we found and how they're similar. So sometimes the words are different, but sometimes the words are the same, such as, for example, Überfremdung. Überfremdung is actually a Nazi word, and was initially only used by the neo-Nazi movement, but later was also used by the other two. We know from identitarians the great replacement. So it's basically the replacement of the native population by the foreigners. The demise of the AfD talks about demise of Germany. So you see various formulations for basically the same thing, and the idea being that one needs to, prognostic framing is the solution. One needs to defend Europe and migration and so forth. And we see this kind of illustrations, for example, how in time the population will change, and the black people will become majority. And this is, by the way, not new. We also have these kinds of illustration in the Nazi time. The same with black people becoming more than the white people. So, and this is important to know, because it's this source that is not necessarily apparent when one looks at these kinds of things. And as I show you this stuff, I'm sure that you have seen it in the populist discourse as well. Things like the refugees have certain advantages which the population doesn't anymore. They frame this as absolutely imminent and urgent. And this is, again, a little bit of a parallel to radicalization, because this imminence and sense of urgency usually requires action. So this hyperbole, this kind of big threatening thing coming. The references to the historical past, Second World War, Battle of Vienna, as I showed you before. And this is important because we know from theory that if you talk to people in terms that they know already, for example, cultural, historical terms, then it's more likely for them to believe what you're saying. Another thing that I think is important, it's apparent if you look at certain outlets, is to see this frame consistency. So, for example, even if it's one event of, say, for example, violence by a refugee against, I don't know, a German woman, for example, what you do is you mention this a lot, so that people have the impression that it's happening all the time, right? So it's not just one occurrence, but basically it's what they do all the time, and it's not going to stop. Important, the manipulation of statistic and other kinds of scientific evidence, which we also see with the conspiracy theories actually as well, because why? This gives a kind of a credibility. So if you show scientific facts, then it's more likely that people will believe what you're going to say. Another thing is also to use statements of people who have a certain credibility. For example, scientists or politicians, mainstream politicians, or doctors. I've seen also recently, especially with QAnon, for example, and all this COVID conspiracy theories, interviews with doctors to say that, Another kind of mainstreaming is, and I wanted to point your attention to this topic. I'm not sure to which extent it's an issue in other countries, but it's definitely in Germany and Austria. And it's funny because the far right talks about the infiltration by the foreigners, but in fact they are doing the infiltration of certain institutions of the state, in particular police, military, and the Office of Protection of the Constitution. Now, this is not something new. It has been going on for a while, but it has become a topic now, something that even the Radicalization Awareness Network is looking at. So what I said here with the tag X, that means the day X. This is basically the day where the government is going to be overthrown by the far-right forces. And this is something that neo-Nazis have been preparing for a while. But recently there was actually a plot by military personnel for this kind of overthrow. Of course, they wouldn't have any success, but still it's important to know that people that have access to guns actually are involved in these kinds of activities. And that's something of a completely different dimension as, for example, a jihadi individual with a knife in the supermarket. Yeah, so it's a different kind of event. These are just this is German, but just to see the numbers. So for example, in 2020, there were 1,016 investigations for extremism in the armed forces. And out of these, only 97 were dismissed. So we can see that there have been quite a few. It's not all right-wing extremism, but the majority is. So 843 were right-wing extremist cases. Another thing that I wanted to share, I don't think I have much time. I think I should have stopped 2 minutes ago. I just go maybe for like about 5 minutes to show you perhaps just one more example to see how populism and right-wing extremism interact. So this is an initiative that was, created a little bit of a scandal recently here in Austria. So this is a project that existed before, and it's looking at Muslim organizations in Austria, and it's actually created a map, like a map where you can click and see, okay, this is the mosque so-and-so, or this is the cultural organization so-and-so, with address and everything. Now, the problem is that, I'm not sure to which extent it's actually even allowed, but anyway, the issue in point was the fact that this map was presented as in the context of fighting extremism. Yeah, so you can see the ethical problematic of this issue, but also the way in which this basically helps out the far right discourse, because what you have here are just regular Muslim entities, whereas presented in the context of fighting extremism, it gives the impression that we're looking at Islamist organizations, and more than that, a lot of them. So what happened, these are the identitarians who went out. Of course, we're very thankful for this initiative. And of course, far right does not differentiate between Islamists and Muslims. So for them, they're all problematic. So what they did was they went out and put these banners, these signs saying, "Attention, political Islam near you." Yeah, I should perhaps mention that here, or at least, in the government discourse, political Islam refers to Islamism, so Islamist extremism. And they put these things next to regular mosques and other kinds of Muslim institutions, which they then identified as being extremist. And again, so they say here the Islam map shows us the dimension of Islamization in Austria, and we're going to show people what this means, and that's basically what they did. And here, just to show you that basically they don't differentiate between regular Muslim life and political extremism, where they say that fear mosques in St. Pölten. St. Pölten is a town around here, Vienna. Fear mosques in St. Pölten are 4 mosques too many. Yeah. So these are the kinds of action we were dealing with, and these are the kinds of actors that get pushed by the mainstream political discourse, which is adopting, as I say, these far-right themes. I should say that identitarians are actually banned in Austria, but they are still active, and they are even using their sign, which is in fact has been banned recently. And I have other stories to tell, but I think this is would be too much for today. I can definitely show the slides, share the slides, and if there's questions, even after the today, you guys can contact me anytime. So if you go actually let me put the website here where you can find me. Yeah, just drop me an email or something. All right, so I think you guys need to go and discuss things now, right? Is that the
Thank you, Daniela. Normally, I think we give a short break, about 10 minutes for everyone. So then we will come for opening the discussion. Thank you again for this rich presentation that you present the main picture of the radicalization and the extremism debates, touching different kind of approaches, methodologies to understand this hot debate today, and also the pop culture as well, with how especially the images, how they are very attractive for the young people by using the pop culture images, icons, whatever. So let's go for the 10 minutes break and then come together. Do you want to say something, Fatma? Or
yes, Daniela, just to clarify, we also wait you in the discussion, right? We would like to ask you questions during the discussion, so it's gonna be okay.
Yes, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay, see you in 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
can see each other. Thank you.